pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with another Friday Reads, and this one's going to be a quickie because I am due to be at my favorite bar, 5-minute walk away, in about 17 minutes or so. And I don't want to be late because I'm ready to start my weekend. However, I did start 3 interesting books this week that I'm dying to tell you about. One is on audio, and I was so pleased when it showed up in my Scribd feed, because just a few days before I had listened to the wonderful interview that Kendra Winchester and Autumn Privet, Kendra's got her own BookTube channel, which I'll link below, and also their podcast link below. Their podcast is called Reading Women, and they did an interview with Maggie O'Farrell about her new memoir, I Am 17 Brushes with Death. And I'm about halfway through on audio, and it's amazing. Now, I read Maggie O'Farrell's novel, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox, last fall and loved it, and that's the only other thing I've read by her. I'm not much of a memoir reader, but this one is really good. It's about exactly what the subtitle suggests. She's had 17 brushes with death, and she writes very vivid and reflective chapters about each of those. Check out the interview that Kendra and Autumn did with her for further information, and I'll have more to say about it once I'm finished. Another one, and this is, I'm taking a page from Simon Savage, who I think he's talked about this strategy on both the podcasts he does with Thomas called The Readers and also here on BookTube, that one of the ways that he incorporates more short stories into his life is that he starts a collection and then reads one story in between every other book he finishes during the year. It works as a palate cleanser, and it's just a way to get into the habit of always having at least one short story collection on the go. I read short stories fairly regularly anyway, but I just thought I would try it because sometimes I don't like to read the next story in the book right away. I want to put the book down, so I thought this would be good. So I have finally started this book that's been on my shelf for a couple years, and look at that cover. A Guide to Being Born by Ramona Ossabel. This was published in 2013, but I just love that cover. I read the first story, and it just blew me away. It's called Safe Passage, and it starts out with dozens of grandmothers who find themselves on a ship in the dark at sea, and they don't know what they're doing there, and it's quite surreal, and it is a wonderful story. And the one in particular that we learn a bit more about is named Alice. On about the 3rd page of the story, I'm going to read you a paragraph, but just to set the paragraph up, several of the old ladies, they're worried about slipping and falling on the deck. It's wet and it's cold, and they're all worried about the husbands or the casseroles they have in the oven and whatnot. So that's just for this quote, and here is a paragraph that I just love. Some grandmothers who are quiet in the huddles do not have these things to go back to. Some have not turned off their televisions in years, not in the morning or at night. They have freezers full of food ready packed for quick eating, and the dents in the cushions where they sit all day, their faces dimming and brightening in the light, are severe. The dents do not repuff because they do not have a chance to do so. They are always under butt. These grandmothers nervously check their watches, still set to home time, knowing that right now, right at this moment, when the sun is falling, Pat Sajak is about to welcome them, with the help of his generous audience, to Wheel of Fortune. Even though they will miss this television evening, those grandmothers, the ones with no one, are not so sorry to be here, at sea, with so many warm bodies. I just find that incredibly moving, and it is quite a moving story. I will say I didn't love the ending of the story as much as I loved the rest of it, but it's really quite striking. And the 3rd book that I have just begun, and I've got such a bare start on it that I can't really talk about it at all, but this has been my 2nd galley proof that I received from NetGalley to review, so I will be doing a full review on this whenever I finish it. It's a novel from the Basque Country. I wasn't fully aware there was such a political entity as the Basque Country. Now, there's the larger Basque Country straddles, so it's an autonomous region, and half in France, half in Spain. But usually when, I now have found out, usually when you hear reference to the Basque Country, I now know, it refers to the Spanish side. But it is an autonomous region, or semi-autonomous, and there has been a lot of political, separatist, paramilitary stuff, which I was only vaguely aware of. I was vaguely aware of it, but not much more than that. And this is a novel that comes from the Basque Country, called Twist by Harkaitz Cano, who is one of the preeminent writers of the Basque Country, and this was translated from the Basque by Amaya Gabancho, and will be published early March by Archipelago Books. This is set in that politically charged climate in the 1980s in the Basque Country, when there was all the paramilitary bombings and kidnappings and murders, and it's about exactly that. It's about the disappearance and brutal murder of two of those paramilitary militants. The name of the group was the ETA. They were murdered by the Spanish army, and it centers on their friend and fellow activist who betrayed them. Political novels like that are really hard to do well, but I'm interested in them. I thought that part of the novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, by Arundhati Roy, was a piece of fiction about a political movement that was particularly well done, although as a whole it didn't quite hang together as a novel. But I thought she wrote about the political, violent realities of Kashmir, in that case, powerfully. And the other one that I thought was of abject failure, was a complete failure, was... Can I pull this name out of my... It's a long sentence, and it was about the Seattle protests, WTO protests. I'll put the name down, but I thought that one was overly sentimentalized and a big disappointment. Anyway, so I've been looking forward to seeing how this goes. I certainly am going to learn a lot, because I'm starting at near zero in terms of my knowledge of the Basque Country. I want to finish with a quote. I'm still reading lots of other books, especially still completely transfixed by Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi. And here's a quote I just read. It really resonates with the one I did last Friday read, so several of you commented on how taken you were with those quotes, so listen to this. This is about 100 pages later. And again, the narrators of this novel about a Nigerian woman who, the old-fashioned phrase was split personality, and the more recent one is dissociative identity disorder. But in this book, it's conceptualized in completely within an African spiritual pantheon, that these gods are inhabiting her, and the narrators are two of those gods. Okay, so listen to this. All the madnesses, each and every blinding one, they can all be traced back to the gates. Those carved monstrosities, those clay and chalk portals, existing everywhere and nowhere, and all at once. They open, things are born, they close. The opening is easy, a pushing out, an expansion, an inhalation, the dust of divinity released into the world. It has to be a temporary channel, though, a thing that is sealed afterward, because the gates stink of knowledge. They cannot be left swinging wide like a slack mouth, leaking mindlessly. That would contaminate the human world. Bodies are not meant to remember things from the other side. There are rules. But these are gods, and they move like heated water, so the rules are softened and stretched. The gods do not care. It is not them, after all, that will pay the cost. The gates stink of knowledge. Whew. I will have much more to say about that when I finish, and I will probably finish that one for sure next week. Still carrying over several that I carried over from January, and some of which I carried over, one in particular that I carried over from last fall, and just been thinking more about slow reading and why it is perfect for me. For example, the Polish novel, The Doll, by Boleslav Prus. I've been reading it off and on since, I think, November. Maybe October, but certainly November. I read 20 or 30 pages a month. I've read about 150 pages now. So maybe 50 pages a month. And I put it down, and a week or 10 days later I pick it up, and I start reading, and I'm not remembering all the details, and I go back and I reread what I had just finished, and then sometimes it picks up a character that was from 75 pages ago, and I read those pages like 90 days before, and I go back and I do a very detailed scan or skim of that section. And so there's something for me about putting a book down, and it's not usually 10 days apart, but in a couple of these books it's turned out that way. But whether it's a day later, 3 days later, or 10 days later, picking a book back up and then re-immersing myself in it and taking that time to pick all the threads back up and hold them again, those books get inside me and the imprint is deep. So to me, that's one of the benefits of rereading, is that I'm constantly trying to reorient myself and put everything back together and keep the flow going. Like, I really think when I read a book in a day, and I'm not, everybody has their own reading style, right? But for me, reading a book in one day is, I don't think I'd remember very much 3 months later. As soon as especially if it's a meaty novel, if it's 300 pages or less, I won't slow down typically. But if it's any longer than that, and I can really feel that it's going to be a wonderful reading experience, my natural response now is to just slow right down and stretch it out over weeks, if not months. And that's what I'm doing with the Polish novel, The Doll, and I seem to be doing it with 2 others that I've carried over from January. I'd like to finish 1 or 2 of those next week, but maybe I won't. And if not, that's the method in my madness. Alright, so what are you doing this weekend, reading-wise or otherwise? Hope you have a great weekend. Thanks for watching.